So if I'm a managing partner, firm-wide leader listening to this, what's the big picture takeaway across all four tiers?
Yeah, I think the tiers are converging. So compliance is still anchoring those smaller firms more than the larger ones. But even the smallest firms in the IPA 500 are building those advisory lines. They're adjusting and thinking about pricing models, and they're concentrating on offshore talent at rates that exceed their bigger peers.
Welcome back. This is the Inside Public Accounting podcast, where we turn the accounting profession's most important data into insights you firm leaders can actually use. I'm Rob Brown.
And I'm Chelsea Summers, Executive Director of Inside Public Accounting.
Now, most of the attention every year goes to the IPA 500, Chelsea. It's the biggest firms, the biggest names. But today, we're going to use our time somewhat differently, haven't we? We're going somewhere different outside the 100.
Yes, we're going to talk about the 200, the 300, the 400, and the 500.
And the four tiers, 400 firms. It's really interesting data that you're putting together with all of these rankings.
Yeah, and I would probably argue that this is where the real story of the profession is playing out. These firms are proving that you don't need to be a top 100 name, a large practice to run a sophisticated, profitable operation.
Yeah, there's some amazing firms on the list. So let's set the stage for our audience. Give us a scale of what we're talking about here with these 400 firms.
Yeah, so the IPA 200 covers those firms ranked number 101 through 200, and they range from 26.7 million to 64.6 million in revenue. Together, they generated just under $4 billion. The IPA 300 picks up in those firms 201 to 300, 16.6 million to 26.6 million, and that's 2.15 billion in combined revenue. The 400 is number 301 to 400 from 10.9 million to 16.5 million. And then that IPA 500 rounds out with number 401 to number 500 from 6.1 million is our IPA 500 firm to 10.9 million.
Astonishing numbers. And these firms are so active. So we're talking about roughly $8 billion there in combined revenue that doesn't nearly get the airtime the top 100 does.
Exactly. And what struck me looking at this year's numbers side by side is these firms aren't just smaller versions of top 100. Right. They're running the same playbook. They're just doing it at different speeds and different scales.
That's a really good way of putting it. Okay, so let's start with the IPA 200 since it's closest to the top 100. What's the headline here?
Headline I saw was discipline. So organic growth held at 7.5%, which was consistent with last year. And total growth, which included mergers, it pulled back a little bit to 8.1%. It was 8.6% last year. So the top line growth is moderating slightly.
But profits didn't moderate, did they?
They did not. So net income grew to 12.6%, which is way ahead of the 7.6% last year.
That's the story, isn't it?
Yeah. Net income per partner came in at $806,000, which was up from $801,000 last year.
That's a very meaningful gap. So growth is cooling, but income is accelerating. How does that happen?
So productivity and cost management. So net revenue per employee climbed to $238,000 from $230,000 last year. That's 5 straight years of gains. And firms are getting more out of every person on staff, even while their personnel cost crept up slightly this year. It was 50.6% of revenue, up from 49.8% of revenue last year.
And I was guest on a firm's podcast recently. It's an internal podcast, a firm called Dean Dorton, Chelsea, and mentioned some of the IPA stats that you've got, and specifically the one where the fastest growing firms have more staff per equity partner than the others, 27 to 16. And that was a really startling start for the firm that I was working with, and just testimony to how these stats really play out in firms and just in their strategy too.
This episode of the Inside Public Accounting podcast is brought to you by Poe Group Advisors. Poe Group Advisors will provide you with a complimentary valuation estimate. As the only full-service investment banking level advisory firm assisting CPA firms in the lower middle market since 2003, they'll give you a complimentary valuation estimate, review any offer you've already received, and help you understand your options. They advocate to protect your legacy and your goals. Call 888-246-0974 or email Bailey Ball at bball@pogroupadvisors.com to start the conversation.
So tax compliance looks like it's still the anchor for this group of firms, Chelsea.
It is. So tax averages 40.3% of their firm-wide revenue, where consulting and advisory pulled back a little bit, down to 30.6% of revenue from 34.5% of revenue the year before.
That is interesting. So advisory is retreating, even as everyone's talking about it being the future.
Yeah, it is interesting. It's a bit of a gut check. I don't think it means advisory is fading. I think it either means that compliance just grew faster this year, which happens. It also could be that the IPA 200 list changed slightly with all of the mergers this year.
Yeah.
But it made me think that the advisory shift isn't going to be a straight line up every year for every tier of firms.
The other aspect too is that compliance is not dying.
No.
It's still very much the backbone, the bread and butter of firms, and maybe they're just doing it better and pricing it better and all kinds of things going on there. Let's talk about offshoring for a moment, Chelsea, because there's a theme running through every one of these tiers.
It is. For the IPA 200, offshoring is really the norm now. 72% of firms employ offshore staff. And among those firms that have offshore staff, they make up about 5.6% of total headcount, which is up from 5.1% the year before. So on top of that, 56% of firms send at least some of their tax prep work to an outside vendor.
So very few firms are pulling back on offshoring.
91% of those firms that are already outsourcing or offshoring plan to keep doing it or expand next year. I think we're not in an experimental phase anymore for these top 200 firms. It's part of their infrastructure.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's working and it's proven. It used to be a stigma back in the day when it started, but now everybody's on board with it because it's a proven model. Let's drop down to the IPA 300, Chelsea. So these are the firms ranked 201 to 300. What changes there?
So growth has slowed a bit more here as well. Organic growth came in at 6.5%, which was down from 8.5% the prior year. But like the 200, profitability was a more positive story. So net income growth stayed in double digits, 10.6%. Net income per partner climbed 5.6% this year, and it was $791,000 per partner.
Okay, so significant. And a similar pattern, the growth is easing, but the profits are holding up.
Yeah. And I think that pattern is probably going to show up in every tier we talk about today. Efficiency is doing a lot of the heavy lifting. Net revenue per FTE reached $230,000. That's about $10,000 up from the year before that.
What about the service mix at this level?
Yeah, so tax continues to be heavy, 42.3% of revenue. But in this tier, advisory is gaining some ground. So client accounting services alone produce $241 million across the group, averaging 12.6% of revenue of the firms that offer it. So investment advisory services also added another $35 million, about 7.2% of revenue for the firms that it offers investment advisory services.
So CAS, while it's still young, it used to be a side offering. It's becoming a real business line.
Yeah, and I think that's important because CAS requires a different delivery model than their compliance work. Firms that are this size are building that muscle that tells you that they're going to be thinking several years ahead.
What does the offshoring look like in this group?
So fewer firms are using it, but the ones that are using it are leaning on it heavier. So 57% of the IPA 300 employ offshore FTEs. But those firms that have offshore staff, it makes up 7.7% of total headcount. So that's a higher concentration than the IPA 200.
Okay, so to translate that, the smaller firms are actually more dependent on offshore staff where they use it, even if fewer of them have adopted it yet.
Yeah, that's the pattern. And we're going to see that get even more pronounced as we move down the tiers. We know many of you listen to this podcast on the go, driving to work, working out, even doing chores. Now you can get CPE credit for that time. With Earmark, you can earn free NASBA-approved CPE for listening to the Inside Public Accounting podcast. After you listen to an episode, take a quiz, and your certificate will be ready. Earmark has courses for everyone in your firm, from staff to partners. Get started today at earmark.app or download the free app on the App Store.
And leverage, staff per equity partner, how does that compare?
So the IPA 300 runs more leverage than the 200. So it's 13.7 FTEs per equity partner versus 12.6. And looking at that 5-year trend, that number has climbed from 11.3 5 years ago to 13.7 today.
So that's a real structural shift. That's not just a 1-year blip.
That's right. Partner compensation for new admits tells I think a story here as well. So new equity partners average 311,000 and new non-equity partners at 205,000. So that's the starting compensation. And the pay spread between the highest and lowest equity partners is 2.7 times. So that's more compressed than 3.3 times we see in the IPA 200.
Okay, so we've covered the 200, we've covered the 300. Let's get to the IPA 400. What's the story there?
So this is where compliance really starts to become a dominant service line. So tax accounts for 45.7% of revenue, the highest share we've seen, and assurance adds another 25.4%. With non-compliance work, that consulting, CAS, advisory, that averages 28.9.
So the smaller the business, the more it's running on compliance.
Consistently, yes. The growth held up reasonably well for this tier as well. So total growth, including mergers, averaged 7.7%, and net income jumped to 11.2% from 7.4% the year before.
So what about partner income?
Yeah, so net income per partner reached 678,000, which is a 3.9% jump from last year. So it's lower in absolute dollars than the larger tiers, but that growth rate shows you that these firms are moving in an upward direction as well.
They're all moving, and it must be that they're pricing differently, they're running more efficiently. I know we've talked about pricing in some of the other issues. Is that a theme here?
Yeah, it's in transition. So traditional hours times rate billing still generates 58.5% of revenue, with fixed or upfront fee arrangements making up 38.9%. So this tier is experimenting with alternative pricing, but it hasn't fully broken free from that billable hour model yet.
The billable hour. And I know you're becoming something of a pricing expert, Chelsea. You've been asked to speak on pricing at certain events. The offshore model is jumping out at me at all levels, but it's particularly interesting here.
Yeah, only 42% of the IPA 400 firms employ offshore staff. So lowest adoption rate we've talked about so far. But at those firms that do, offshore FTEs make up 9% of total headcount. That is a very high concentration.
So again, fewer firms are doing it. The ones that commit to it, they're going all in.
Yeah, that's the pattern that we're seeing. At 80% of firms that are already using outsourcing or offshoring plan to sustain or grow it next year. So once those firms cross that adoption threshold, they really don't look back.
Mm-hmm. What about leverage, which is becoming my favorite statistic in some of these rankings?
11.8 FTEs per equity partner. So a little bit smaller than the IPA 300 at 13.7. But that makes sense given these firms are smaller and smaller firms are typically a little more flat. But when we look at the 5-year trend, leverage has climbed from 9.7 FTEs per partner 5 years ago to 11.8 today. That's a big shift for firms of the size.
And it's amazing that you can see it over 5 years, Chelsea, because you've got that longitudinal data and you look for patterns over time. And so many things come out that you don't see in a one-off hit. Mm-hmm. So let's finish with the IPA 500, the smallest firms in the ranking. So these are 401 to 500. What's going on there?
So they're the smallest by revenue, with that IPA 500 coming in at 6.1 million this year. But they're not small in impact. So they generated $878 million in revenue together. And their tax compliance work was very dominant. So 47.1% of total revenue came from tax compliance. And assurance added 23.6%.
And growth?
Pretty strong. So organic growth came in at 7.8% and total growth reached 7.9% with mergers included. So that's pretty in line with those larger tiers. So I don't think that growth is just a big firm story. It's consistent on all size firms.
What about the bottom line?
So net income growth was a little bit more modest for these IPA 500. It was 6.1%, but that was up from 5.5% last year. So smaller than the double-digit gains we saw in the IPA 100 or those larger firms. But we did see personnel costs hold at 46.5% of revenue. So that's the lowest personnel cost we saw of any group.
So less top line growth, but tighter disciplines with costs.
Yeah. And I think that discipline is one of the reasons that these IPA 500 remain viable and independent, even at this size.
Yeah. So the offshore number, I'm guessing, is going to be the most extreme of the day. We've seen the direction of travel here.
It is. Only 36.5% of the IPA 500 employ offshore FTE. So that's the lowest adoption rate of any tier, consistent with the trend we're seeing so far. But in those firms that have offshore staff, they make up 9.6% of headcount, the highest concentration that we've seen.
So the smallest firms in our rankings have the least adoption and the deepest reliance once they do adopt.
Yeah. And 82% of those firms plan to maintain or expand their offshoring strategies. So even at the smaller end of the market, once the firms commit, they really stick with it and grow it.
So give us the leverage and partner pay figures to close that out.
Yeah, so leverage is the leanest of all the rankings at 9.8 FTEs per equity partner, but it is up slightly from 9.6 the year before. Partner pay is the most egalitarian of any tier. The highest paid partner earns just 2.1 times the lowest paid partner. It's a compression trend that runs from the IPA 200 3.3 times and goes down in the tiers.
So if I'm a managing partner, firm-wide leader listening to this, what's the big picture takeaway across all 4 tiers?
Yeah, I think the tiers are converging. So compliance is still anchoring those smaller firms more than the larger ones. But even the smallest firms in the IPA 500 are building those advisory lines. They're adjusting and thinking about pricing models, and they're concentrating on offshore talent at rates that exceed their bigger peers.
So it's the same game. They're just playing it at different speeds.
Exactly. 5 years ago, a lot of these strategies, offshore staffing, alternative pricing, CAS as a real business line, were very top 100 conversations. But now they're showing up meaningfully in firms as small as $6 million in revenue.
Which means the strategic gap between the $10 million firms and the $60 million firms, that's narrower than it used to be.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So growth is broadly healthy across every tier. Profits are rising over the last 5-year window that we looked at. And leverage has climbed steadily in the 200, in the 300, 400, and 500 specifically. So these firms are professionalizing pretty fast.
I love that word, professionalizing. That sums it up really well, Dave.
I don't know if it's a real word, but we're going to use it today.
No, I got it. We're creating a new dictionary, a new doxology, as they say. But that's right. They are. They're getting slicker. They're getting more powerful. They're getting more leverage. They're utilizing everything at their disposal. It's such a great message. So what we're saying here is for the firm leaders outside the top 100, don't assume these strategies just apply to the big names.
Yeah, if you're running a $15 million firm and you're not thinking about offshore capacity, alternative pricing, or advisory services, your peers in the same tier as you already are. And the data is showing that those experiments are really paying off for those firms.
It's a classic good to great question, isn't it? What are the great firms doing that the good firms are not? And this data really highlights it. Well, Chelsea, this has been an amazing tour through data that we don't spend enough time on. And thanks for walking us through.
Always happy to dig in the tiers that don't always get all the spotlight. There is a lot happening here, and we just gave you the top high-level highlights of those 200, 300, 400, and 500 firms. We will be publishing a lot more in our August IPA Insights. So if you're interested, check out the show notes, and we will have links to purchase.
Yeah. That's it for today's episode of the Inside Public Accounting Podcast. If you found this helpful, please like and subscribe. We love it that you do that. Leave us a comment. We listen and watch for all of those. We'd love to hear on how your firm stacks up against these numbers.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can click below to subscribe and check out more from Inside Public Accounting.